paid in millions, contractually mandated to be flawless, syndicated globally. On screen, Uncle Jesse was everyone's crush. In reality, John Stamos had a very dark side. The ultimate television protector was a functioning alcoholic, desperately burying a 40-year secret of severe childhood trauma. What happens when a multi-million-dollar corporate asset succumbs to severe substance dependency to maintain an illusion? Long before the network executives constructed the persona that would define him, John Stamos was simply a young man born into a working-class Greek-American family in California. Born in 1963, he entered a world on the verge of a massive media shift. By the time he reached his late teens, the television industry was frantically searching for a new, highly lucrative demographic. The daytime soap opera, previously a domain strictly formulated for older housewives, was aggressively pivoting to capture the youth market. The studios needed fresh, unblemished faces to sell this transition. They needed assets who looked dangerous enough to be exciting, but safe enough to be broadcast into millions of living rooms every afternoon without causing advertiser backlash. In 1982, Stamos was cast as Blackie Parrish on the daytime drama General Hospital. It was a highly calculated casting decision by a network desperate for younger viewers. The executives did not just hire an actor. They acquired a raw, highly marketable commodity. Historical data from daytime television in that era shows a massive, immediate spike in teenage viewership the moment this specific archetype was introduced. Stamos was thrown into a relentless production schedule. He was immediately subjected to the crushing weight of sudden manufactured fame. Millions of letters poured into the studio. Routine mall appearances turned into literal riots requiring heavy police intervention. It was a baptism by fire in an industry that offered no psychological support, no boundaries, and no protection for indui. T.S. Young Investments. The television executives realized very quickly that they had struck a vein of gold. They possessed a physical asset that generated millions of dollars in advertising revenue. And the golden rule of television production in the 1980s was uncompromising. Once you find a profitable commodity, you lock it down. You exploit it to its absolute limit, and you aggressively eliminate any aspect of the individual's real personality that does not serve the corporate brand. Stamos was given wealth and adoration, but the immediate cost was his autonomy. The man was already disappearing, replaced by a smiling phantom designed to sell soap and cereal. And this was only the testing ground for the much larger, far more restrictive cage that awaited him on primetime television. The transition from the frenetic daily grind of a daytime soap opera to the highly structured ecosystem of primetime television is rarely a seamless ascent. For John Stamos, leaving General Hospital in the mid-1980s was a calculated risk, an attempt to break free from a genre that the broader entertainment industry often viewed with thinly veiled contempt. He navigated the brutal reality of pilot season, a grueling process where young actors are paraded before network executives, scrutinized not just for their talent, but for their demographic appeal and marketability. After a few short-lived projects, he collided with a concept that would permanently alter the trajectory of his life and career. In 1987, the ABC network, alongside Laura Martella Pictures, launched a family sitcom titled Full House. The premise was aggressively conventional, designed specifically to capture the rapidly expanding market of family-oriented evening viewers. To anchor this project, the producers required a specific type of magnetism. They needed an actor who could act as a bridge between the wholesome innocence of the child actors and the adult audiences sitting at home. They needed a corporate ass, capable of projecting danger without ever actually being dangerous. They found their perfect commodity in Stamos. The character he was hired to portray was initially named Uncle Adam, then Jesse Cochran, before finally being tailored to Stamos' own Greek heritage as Jesse Katsopoulos. But the name was irrelevant. The function of the character was everything. Uncle Jesse was meticulously engineered by writers and producers to be the ultimate safe rebel. He was outfitted in a leather jacket, placed on a motorcycle, and given a guitar, but these were merely props in a carefully controlled theatrical display. The network executives understood a fundamental psychological trigger in their audience. They wanted the aesthetic of rock and roll rebellion stripped entirely of its actual anarchy, substance abuse, and unpredictability. Stamos was tasked with embodying a sterilized version of masculinity. He was required to be undeniably attractive, a potent sex symbol who could draw female viewers across multiple demographics. Yet he had to remain perpetually domesticated, endlessly patient, and entirely submissive to the moral framework of a family sitcom. This paradox created a profound psychological trap. On the surface, the success of Full House was staggering. By its second and third seasons, the program had evolved from a moderately successful show into a global cultural behemoth. It became a cornerstone of ABC's TGIF programming block, drawing tens of millions of viewers every single week. Stamos was elevated from a working actor to a household name, an international icon recognized in almost every country with television access. But behind the walls of the soundstage in Burbank, California, the reality of this elevation was deeply restrictive. The television industry during the late 20th century operated on a ruthless financial model heavily reliant on syndication. The ultimate goal of any studio was to produce enough episodes, usually around the 100 mark, to sell the reruns into syndication, where the actual multi-million-dollar profits were generated. To achieve this, consistency was paramount. The studio demanded absolute uniformity. For Stamos, this meant signing legally binding contracts that dictated not just his working hours, but his physical appearance and public conduct. The famous hair, the specific cadence of his catchphrases, the very shape of his body, these no longer belonged entirely to him. They were the intellectual property of the network. He was effectively locked into a highly lucrative holding pattern. The schedule of a network sitcom is famously relentless, demanding up to 24 episodes a year. Actors are isolated on closed sets for months at a time, entirely removed from the reality of the outside world, surrounded by a hierarchical system where executives monitor every take, every rating point, and every audience reaction. Stamos was working within a gilded cage, heavily compensated but creatively paralyzed. The psychological dissonance of this environment cannot be overstated. Every Friday night, Stamos stood before a live studio audience, receiving immediate, intoxicating waves of adoration. The laughter and applause provide a powerful weekly surge of dopamine, reinforcing the illusion that the actor is in complete control of their environment. He negotiated larger dressing rooms, better parking spaces, and incremental increases in his salary. These small victories gave him the impression of wielding significant industry power. However, this was a carefully maintained illusion. The true power remained exclusively in the corporate boardrooms. If he expressed a desire to drastically alter his character's trajectory, to explore darker or more complex narratives, he was swiftly reminded of his function. The machine did not pay him to be an artist. It paid him to be a reliable, unchanging product. This dynamic became particularly agonizing when observing his genuine musical ambitions. Stamos Way, as an accomplished drummer and a capable musician long before he set foot on the Full House set. He possessed a legitimate, deep-rooted passion for music, eventually leading to a decades-long association and touring schedule with the legendary American rock band, the Beach Boys. This was an authentic aspect of his identity, a connection to a raw, historical musical legacy. Yet the television network immediately recognized the value of this talent and co-opted it for the sitcom. They integrated his musicality into the show, creating the fictional band Jesse and the Rippers. What was once a private, authentic passion was instantly commodified, watered down, and packaged into 3-minute, family-friendly musical interludes designed to boost ratings. His real-world talent was cannibalized to feed the fictional persona. The boundary between John Stamos, the musician, and Uncle Jesse, the television character, completely disintegrated in the eyes of the public. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, the weight of this inescapable identity began to suffocate him. He was approaching 30, a critical age for any leading man in Hollywood, yet he was permanently frozen in the public consciousness as the 20-something, leather-clad uncle. The industry has a term for this phenomenon: typecasting. But for actors caught in massive, defining network hits, typecasting is too mild a word. It is a total erasure of the self. Casting directors for serious feature films or dramatic television projects could no longer look at him and see a versatile actor. They only saw a walking, breathing sitcom trope. His very face had become a liability for any project that required darkness, nuance, or ambiguity. He was deemed too recognizable, too safe, too indelibly linked to the saccharine morality of Friday night television. The fear of permanent irrelevance began to take root. Stamos was intelligent enough to understand the mechanics of the industry he inhabited. He knew that television fame is historically highly perishable. The studios extract maximum value from an actor during their physical prime and discard them the moment the ratings dip or the demographic shifts. He was acutely aware that the very machine that was currently paying him millions of dollars would not hesitate to abandon him once the syndication threshold was met, and the show eventually concluded. This constant underlying anxiety, the knowledge that his immense success was entirely dependent on a system that viewed him as disposable equipment, created a breeding ground for severe internal conflict. He was trapped in a paradox that destroys many performers. To rebel overtly, to walk off the set, to publicly denounce the show, or to deliberately sabotage his own image would mean financial ruin, lawsuits, and the alienation of a massive, adoring fan base. He would be labeled difficult, ungrateful, and unhireable. The system ensures that the cost of rebellion is professional suicide. Therefore, the only option was compliance. He had to smile on command, deliver the catchphrases with feigned enthusiasm, and pretend that playing the same two-dimensional archetype for nearly a decade was creatively fulfilling. He had to swallow the reality that he was participating in his own artistic stagnation. This prolonged suppression of his true identity, combined with the crushing pressure to maintain a facade of effortless perfection, began to create deep, invisible fractures within his psyche. The human mind can only sustain a fabricated reality for so long before the tension demands a release, while the public saw a man at the absolute zenith of his career, enjoying wealth, status, and universal acclaim. The man himself was navigating a silent internal crisis. He was desperately searching for a way to assert his own existence outside the boundaries of the character he had been hired to play. He needed to prove to himself, and perhaps to the world, that he was more than just a sterilized product of network engineering. This desperate need for genuine connection, for an identity separate from the studio's creation, heavily influenced his personal choices as the decade progressed. It drove him to seek validation in high-profile relationships, attempting to construct a private life that felt as grand and significant as his public persona. He was looking for an anchor in a reality that felt increasingly artificial. But in the entertainment industry, the personal lives of major stars are never truly private. They are simply another sector of the economy, monitored and monetized by a different set of corporate entities. As Stamos attempted to build a life outside the sound stage, he was completely unaware that he was simply stepping out of the network's controlled environment and walking directly into the crosshairs of a far more predatory, unregulated machine. The tabloid industry was watching, waiting for the pristine facade to crack, ready to turn his search for humanity into their next major headline. The golden handcuffs of the sitcom were about to be replaced by the relentless, blinding flash of the paparazzi cameras, marking the beginning of a brutal new phase in his commodification. The moment the heavy sound stage doors of Full House closed for the final time in 1995, the silence that followed was deafening. For nearly a decade, John Stamos had his days meticulously scheduled down to the minute. His wardrobe, his lines, and his public appearances were dictated by a vast corporate apparatus. When the network syndication quota was fulfilled and the sets were dismantled, the protective barrier of the studio system vanished overnight. He was thrust out of the controlled environment of network television and directly into the brutal, chaotic reality of the late 1990s celebrity ecosystem. He was 32 years old, immensely wealthy, globally recognized, and completely untethered. The industry had extracted what it needed from his youth, and now he faced the terrifying ECT of the void. Who exactly was John Stamos when nobody was handing him a script? To understand the danger of this transition, one must examine the fundamental shift in entertainment media during this exact era. The late 1990s witnessed the aggressive evolution of the tabloid industry. The polite studio-managed press coverage of the past had been entirely replaced by a predatory, billion-dollar paparazzi culture. Magazines were no longer satisfied with orchestrated red carpet smiles or sanitized press releases. The new currency of the realm was intrusion. The public appetite had grown increasingly voracious. They demanded to see the cracks in the porcelain. They wanted evidence of failure, of aging, of marital discord. Stamos, a man who had spent his entire adult life being worshipped as a flawless television idol, was suddenly walking into a landscape where his vulnerability was the most valuable commodity on the market. The television networks had commodified his youth, but the tabloid industry aimed to commodify his private life. The transition was seamless, brutal, and highly efficient. As Stamos desperately sought to construct a legitimate identity separate from Uncle Jesse, he realized that the public and the press refused to let the character die. Every professional move he made was instantly measured against his sitcom legacy. The psychological pressure of this permanent categorization was immense. He was a working actor actively attempting to pivot toward more mature, demanding roles on Broadway and independent cinema, but the industry gatekeepers continually reduced him to the handsome guy with the great hair. It was within this suffocating atmosphere of existential dread and professional stagnation that he met Rebecca Romijn. When they began dating in 1994, she was rapidly ascending as one of the most prominent supermodels in the world, a fixture in the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue and Victoria's Secret campaigns. To the outside observer, their union seemed like a masterclass in genetic and social engineering. They were the ultimate aesthetic match. Two impossibly beautiful people operating at the absolute zenith of 1990s pop culture. When they married in 1998 in a lavish ceremony at the Beverly Hills Hotel, the media reaction was explosive. However, in Hollywood, a marriage of this magnitude is rarely permitted to exist simply as a legal and emotional union between two human beings. The moment they said their vows, their relationship was instantly hijacked and weaponized by the entertainment press. They ceased being John and Rebecca. They were transformed into a joint corporate venture. They became a high-yield asset for magazine publishers and television shows. The system recognized that the image of the aging teen idol finally settling down with the global supermodel was an incredibly lucrative narrative. It sold magazines by the millions. This dynamic created an agonizing dual reality. There was a desperate, genuine attempt by two people to build a life together, to establish boundaries, and to create a sanctuary away from the relentless glare of the cameras. This was their internal fight for survival. But running parallel to this was the unrelenting pressure from the external system, which demanded constant visible proof of their perfection. The red carpet was no longer a promotional duty, it was a battlefield. They were required to perform their love, to smile endlessly, and to present a flawless, impenetrable front to an industry that was actively searching for any sign of weakness. The paparazzi did not merely follow them, they hunted them. The lens of a telephoto camera is not a passive observer. It is an active weapon of psychological destabilization. Photographers staked out their home, trailed their vehicles, and invaded their most private moments. Every grocery store run, every dinner date, and every casual walk was heavily documented, scrutinized, and sold to the highest bidder. When a couple is subjected to this level of continuous hostile observation, the architecture of the relationship inevitably begins to warp. The home ceases to be a refuge and becomes a bunker. The constant vigilance required to navigate public spaces drains the emotional reserves needed to sustain a marriage behind closed doors. Stamos found himself caught in a devastating paradox. His professional career post-Full House was struggling to gain significant momentum. The blockbuster movie roles were not materializing, and the attempts to launch new television series frequently stalled. Ironically, his primary source of cultural relevance was no longer his acting ability. It was his status as the husband of a massive international star. As Romain's acting career began to skyrocket, with high-profile roles in blockbuster franchises like X-Men, the power dynamic in the relationship shifted dramatically under the brutal, unforgiving spotlight of the media. The tabloids gleefully seized upon this narrative. They began to publish insidious stories, framing Stamos as the washed-up television actor clinging to his increasingly famous wife. The cruelty of these narratives was deliberate. The tabloid machine understands that attacking a man's ego and professional standing is the fastest way to generate conflict. Stamos, who had spent a decade being the undisputed center of gravity on a massive television hit, was suddenly being relegated to the role of the supportive spouse on red carpets. The system was actively trying to humiliate him to provoke a reaction. And the pressure was working. Behind the impenetrable photogenic smiles, the foundation of the marriage was slowly being pulverized by the sheer force of public scrutiny and internal insecurity. Every rumor, every fabricated story of jealousy, and every invasive photograph forced the couple into a defensive posture. They were constantly required to issue denials, to reaffirm their commitment through publicists, and to prove their happiness to elude strangers. This performative maintenance of a marriage is exhausting. It forces individuals to view their own relationship through the warped, cynical lens of the press. You begin to question your own reality when millions of people are constantly analyzing and dissecting your personal life. The industry had successfully turned their intimacy into a spectator sport, and in doing so, they had fundamentally compromised the safety of the relationship. The situation was compounded by the intense biological and social pressures placed upon women in the industry, which Romain was simultaneously navigating. But for Stamos, the crisis was uniquely tied to his loss of control. He had always relied on his charm, his work ethic, and his ability to navigate the studio system to secure his position. Now he was trapped in a game where the rules were constantly changing, and the opponents were faceless photographers and ruthless editors. He could not charm his way out of a paparazzi ambush. He could not outwork a malicious tabloid rumor. He was experiencing a profound loss of agency. He was attempting to hold on to a pristine image of masculinity that the system itself had manufactured for him, while simultaneously dealing with the very real, messy, and complicated dynamics of a failing marriage under an international microscope. He was smiling for the cameras while actively drowning. He began to seek momentary escapes, small acts of rebellion against the suffocating expectations placed upon him. These were the preliminary, subtle fractures in the facade. The industry demanded that he remain Uncle Jesse, the perfect husband, the eternal idol. But the human being inside the cage was suffocating, and a suffocating man will eventually lash out regardless of the consequences. The breaking point was not a single catastrophic event, but rather a slow, agonizing erosion of trust, patience, and sanity. As the new millennium dawned, the marriage that the media had anointed as Hollywood, D-royalty was hollowed out entirely. The contract of perfection had become too expensive to maintain. The very system that had elevated their relationship, that had plastered their faces across every newsstand in America, was now eagerly waiting to profit from its demolition. The tabloids had built the pedestal specifically so they could film the fall. Stamos was standing on the edge of a precipice, realizing that the only way to escape the excruciating pressure of being the perfect husband was to completely self-destruct in the most public way possible. The transition from the golden boy of network television to the bitter, volatile subject of tabloid scandal was about to be completed, and the media ecosystem was preparing its cameras for the crash. The fracture finally became visible to the public in April 2004. After years of fending off rumors and presenting a united front, the machinery behind John Stamos and Rebecca Romain issued the standard sanitized press release announcing their separation. In the sterile language of Hollywood public relations, the split was described as amicable, a mutual decision devoid of third-party involvement. It was a desperate, final attempt by their respective crisis management teams to control the narrative and protect the marketability of both individuals. But the entertainment press, having patiently waited for this exact moment, immediately recognized the blood in the water. The carefully constructed dam had broken, and the tabloids surged forward to drown them in speculation. The dissolution of a high-profile Hollywood marriage is not merely an emotional tragedy. It is an economic event. Entire editorial calendars were abruptly cleared to make room for the autopsy of their relationship. The system that had previously profited from their immaculate wedding photos now pivoted with ruthless efficiency to profit from their misery. Reporters were dispatched to dig through property records, legal filings, and the whisper networks of Hollywood assistants. For Stamos, the separation marked the beginning of a profound psychological unraveling. He was stripped of the armor that his marriage to a global supermodel had temporarily provided. He was entirely exposed, forced to navigate the most devastating personal failure of his life under the relentless, microscopic scrutiny of an industry that views pain purely as content. What shocked the public and the industry was his reaction. For nearly 2 decades, Stamos had rigidly adhered to the unwritten rules of celebrity conduct. He had always been the consummate professional, the affable charmer who handled intrusive questions with a disarming smile and a clever deflection. He was trained by the studio system to never let the audience see the anger beneath the surface. But the divorce shattered this conditioning entirely. Stamos did not retreat into a dignified silence, nor did he stick to the sanitized talking points provided by his publicists. Instead, he exhibited a raw, visceral bitterness that completely contradicted his carefully cultivated public persona. In the interviews following the separation, he bypassed the standard Hollywood diplomacy and spoke with a startling, almost reckless candor. He publicly articulated his resentment, expressing profound hurt over how quickly the marriage had unraveled and how swiftly Roman appeared to move on. He was grieving, and for the first time in his career, he refused to sanitize his grief for public consumption. This anger was not a calculated media strategy. It was an authentic, desperate flailing of a man who felt he had played by all the industry's rules and still lost everything. He had been the perfect television uncle, the perfect red carpet husband, and yet he found himself sitting in a massive empty house while the tabloids actively dismantled his dignity. Decades later, Stamos would offer a far more complex, self-indicting analysis of this period. He would publicly admit that his own behavior during Tia Oa marriage was deeply flawed, acknowledging his own infidelity and emotional failures. This admission is crucial to understanding the mechanics of his downfall. Stamos grew up rooted in a working-class Greek culture that deeply valued family, loyalty, and lifelong partnership. The failure of his marriage was not just a public relations disaster, it was a devastating personal failure that struck at the core of his identity. He had failed at the one thing he had genuinely wanted to succeed at outside of his career. This dissonance between the family man he genuinely wanted to be and the destructive reality of his actions created a psychological torment that the public could not see. The infidelity was a symptom of a deeper rot, a manifestation of the intense, unspoken pressure cooker of a two-celebrity household where true intimacy is constantly eroded by professional paranoia. When you are trained to constantly manage your image, you lose the ability to be truly authentic, even with the person you sleep next to. The marriage became just another performance, and eventually, he forgot his lines. The infidelity was not simply a moral lapse, viewed through the lens of psychological rebellion. It was an act of profound self-sabotage. When an individual is trapped in an environment that demands absolute, unrelenting perfection, a perfection enforced by studios, publicists, and millions of fans, the pressure becomes suffocating. Subconsciously, the only way to escape the crushing weight of the pedestal is to intentionally jump off it. By actively damaging the marriage, he was orchestrating the destruction of the pristine image that had imprisoned him since the 1980s. He was breaking the golden handcuffs. It was a destructive, deeply harmful way to assert his own agency, but it was an assertion nonetheless. He proved in the most painful way possible that he was not Uncle Jesse. He was a flawed, volatile human being capable of inflicting damage on himself and the people he loved. But this internal psychological complexity was utterly irrelevant to the media ecosystem. The tabloids did not care about his desperate need to shatter an artificial idol. They only cared that he had provided them with the ultimate scandal. The industry's reaction to his bitterness and subsequent admission of fault was ruthlessly predictable. The narrative shifted instantly. He was no longer the tragic victim of a Hollywood divorce. He was painted as the bitter, aging television actor lashing out at his ascendant ex-wife. The mid-2000s marked the absolute zenith of cruel, unregulated celebrity blog culture. Websites and magazines operated without editorial oversight or basic human decency. They thrived on cruelty. For Stamos, this meant that his divorce was not just reported, it was mocked. Paparazzi aggressively provoked him on the streets, hoping to capture a photograph of an angry, unhinged former teen idol. They wanted the money shot, the hero looking like a villain. The press used his raw emotional state against him, framing his anger as pathetic rather than human. Articles dissected his career trajectory, unfavorably comparing his resume to Romeen's blockbuster success. The goal was to emasculate him publicly, to generate outrage and sell magazines by presenting him as the villain in a soap opera that the media was actively writing. The psychological warfare was relentless. He was trapped in a feedback loop where his genuine anger was provoked by the press, captured by the cameras, and then used as proof that he was unstable. It is a brilliant, insidious trap designed by the media ecosystem to ensure that the celebrity can never win. If he stayed silent, he was defeated. If he fought back, he was crazy. Every time he spoke out, every time he let the mask slip and revealed his genuine devastation, the tabloids monetized his pain. The system operates on a parasitic logic. It feeds on the vulnerability of its subjects. Stamos, in his grief, was bleeding out in tea. He public square, and the industry was charging admission. The psychological isolation of this experience is absolute. When the world demands that you smile through your devastation and punishes you when you refuse, a profound paranoia sets in. You realize that your handlers, the press, and the audience do not view you as a human being worthy of empathy. They view you as a malfunctioning product that needs to either fix itself or provide entertainment through its destruction. By the time the divorce was finalized in early 2005, the landscape of his life was entirely unrecognizable. The safety net of the studio system was a distant memory. The glamorous armor of his high-profile marriage had been violently stripped away. His professional identity was mired in stalled projects and the inescapable shadow of a sitcom character he desperately wanted to leave behind. He was in his early 40s, facing a terrifying void. The external battles with the press and the internal battles with his own guilt and resentment had entirely depleted his emotional reserves. He had fought the system's demand for perfection by destroying his own life, but the victory was entirely hollow. He had escaped the gilded cage of his flawless image, only to find himself standing in the ruins of his own making. The reality of his situation was stark. He was wealthy, yet profoundly lonely. He was famous, yet deeply misunderstood. The noise of the paparazzi cameras outside his gates was a constant mocking reminder of his failures. The human nervous system is not designed to process this level of sustained public humiliation and internal grief without finding an outlet. When the reality of your existence becomes unbearable and every attempt to assert your humanity is weaponized against you by a billion-dollar media machine, the instinct for survival often morphs into an instinct for anesthesia. He needed a way to turn off the blinding lights of the press, and more importantly, he needed a way to silence the deafening noise of his own thoughts. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only a vast, terrifying emptiness. The television idol was dead, the perfect husband was gone, and the man left behind was fundamentally unequipped to handle the silence. He looked for a chemical shield to replace the PR armor he had lost. The descent into the darkest chapter of his life was not a sudden fall. It was a slow, deliberate march toward oblivion, driven by the desperate need to simply stop feeling. The transition into profound substance abuse had begun, and the industry, waiting patiently in the shadows, prepared to document every agonizing step of his surrender. The descent into severe alcoholism is rarely a sudden plunge. It is a meticulously negotiated surrender. For John Stamos, the transition from the celebratory champagne of Hollywood premieres to the desperate, solitary drinking of a man in crisis was masked by the very industry that facilitated it. We are conditioned by popular media to view celebrity addiction as an explosive, highly visible catastrophe. The reality is far more insidious. In the upper echelons of the entertainment business, severe substance abuse is not immediately punished. It is heavily managed. An ecosystem of enablers, assistants, managers, publicists, and studio executives springs into action to protect the investment. They will procure the substances, hide the erratic behavior, and fiercely guard the closed doors, so long as the actor can still stand on his mark and deliver his lines when the camera rolls. Stamos was caught in the deadly trap of the high-functioning alcoholic. He was allowed to drown, provided he did so quietly and off company time. The profound danger of this enabled environment is that it removes all natural consequences. When the public perceives an actor moving seamlessly from one project to another, they assume stability. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, Stamos actively sought professional redemption. He joined the CAE, saint of the prestigious medical drama ER, taking on the role of Dr. Tony Gates. He appeared in high-profile Broadway productions and secured recurring roles on popular television shows like Glee. To the untrained eye, the Hollywood machine had successfully rehabilitated him. He was back in prime time, back in the perfectly tailored suits, projecting the confident, mature charm that the networks demanded. But this professional resurgence required a monumental, agonizing effort of compartmentalization. He was effectively splitting his existence into two fiercely guarded halves. By day, he was the consummate professional, hitting his marks and reciting medical jargon. By night, he was retreating into an increasingly dark and isolated world, using alcohol as a chemical sledgehammer to silence the unbearable anxiety and the residual trauma of his public humiliation. This dual existence is neurologically unsustainable. The human brain cannot indefinitely maintain a flawless public facade while actively poisoning itself in private. The alcohol ceased to be a temporary escape from his divorce or his stalled career. It became the central organizing principle of his life. The industry demands an astonishing amount of emotional labor from its performers. You are required to generate empathy, charisma, and vulnerability on cue, take after take. For a man whose internal emotional landscape was a battlefield of resentment and unhealed wounds, manufacturing this artificial warmth for the cameras required a massive toll. The alcohol became the toll he paid to himself. It was the only mechanism he possessed to numb the terrifying dissonance between the beloved character he played on television and the broken man he saw in the mirror. The entertainment press, completely blind to the systemic nature of his disease, continued to view him through the cynical lens of content generation. They were not investigating a medical crisis. They were simply waiting for a punchline. The culture of the early 2000s was notoriously unforgiving toward celebrity struggles, treating addiction as a moral failing rather than a lethal illness. Late-night talk show hosts and gossip blogs weaponized his vulnerability, utilizing every bloated photograph or slightly slurred interview as ammunition for cheap entertainment. He was acutely aware of this surveillance, the paranoia of being caught, of having his carefully managed secret exposed to a public that had already mocked his divorce drove him further into isolation. The walls of his home became a fortress. The man who had spent his entire life craving the affection of an audience now viewed the outside world as a hostile, predatory force. The inevitable collision between his private deterioration and his public image occurred on a Friday evening in June 2015. The protective barrier of his enablers finally collapsed. Stamos was arrested by the Beverly Hills Police Department for driving under the influence. The details of the arrest are a chilling testament to how far he had fallen. He was not merely pulled over for a minor traffic violation. His driving was so erratic that multiple concerned citizens contacted law enforcement, reporting a vehicle that was behaving dangerously on the busy streets of Los Angeles. When officers intercepted his vehicle, his physical condition was so alarming that they completely bypassed the standard procedure of transporting him to a holding cell. The police immediately summoned paramedics, and Stamos was rushed directly to a local hospital for a medical emergency. This was not a glamorous Hollywood scandal. It was a near-fatal medical crisis unfolding in real time. Yet, the machinery of the media instantly stripped the event of its grim reality. Within hours, the news was violently broadcast across every digital platform and news network. The narrative was immediately framed around his celebrity status. The headlines did not speak of a man in the grip of a life-threatening disease. They spoke of Uncle Jesse's spectacular fall from grace. The arrest was converted into digital currency, generating millions of clicks and endless hours of speculative commentary. The system had finally gotten the ultimate money shot. The flawless television idol publicly stripped of his dignity, rendered incapacitated and vulnerable in a hospital bed. The aftermath of the arrest forced Stamos into the most terrifying psychological corner of his existence. He was completely trapped. The illusion of the high-functioning professional was shattered beyond repair. The industry that had previously protected his secret now viewed him as a massive liability. In television production, an actor with an untreated, highly public substance abuse problem represents an unacceptable financial risk. Insurance premiums skyrocket, shooting schedules are threatened, and network executives panic over potential advertiser boycotts. The cold, unfeeling calculus of Hollywood dictated that he was no longer a reliable machine for generating profit. He was given a silent, unspoken ultimatum by the very industry that had fueled his ascent. Fix the machine or be permanently discarded. He found himself standing at the edge of an existential abyss, facing the three brutal paths available to a fallen idol. The first path was absolute surrender. He could allow the disease to run its full course, retreating entirely from the public eye and succumbing entirely to his dangerous dependencies. A path countless Hollywood icons had walked before him, their deaths inevitably repackaged by the press as tragic inevitabilities. The second path was to become a professional pariah, a punchline forced to accept degrading reality television offers to pay the legal bills, allowing the media to slowly strip away whatever shreds of dignity remained. The third path was the most terrifying. It required him to completely dismantle the artificial construct of John Stamos the celebrity, to walk away from the cameras and to soar and dare to the agonizing, unglamorous reality of medical rehabilitation. In the weeks following the hospital intervention, guided by desperate family members and a few remaining allies within the industry who prioritized his life over his marketability, Stamos chose the third path. He checked into a residential rehabilitation facility. This decision marked a fundamental shift in his narrative. It was the first time in over 30 years that he actively chose his own survival over the maintenance of his public image. Stepping into that facility was not an act of defeat. It was a profound act of rebellion against the Hollywood system. By admitting his absolute powerlessness, he fired his publicists, silenced the enablers, and finally confronted the terrifying silence he had spent his entire adult life trying to outrun. However, the process of rehabilitation is fundamentally misunderstood by the public. We are sold a sanitized, cinematic version of recovery, where a brief stint in a scenic facility cures the patient, allowing them to emerge completely transformed and ready to conquer the world. The reality of clinical detoxification and psychological therapy is brutal, exhausting, and deeply painful. As the alcohol was systematically drained from his physical body, the chemical shield that had protected him for a decade dissolved. The profound emotional numbness vanished, and every suppressed emotion, every buried failure, and every ounce of internalized shame returned with devastating force. He was forced to sit in a sterile room and answer the most terrifying question a human being can face. Why were you driven to such extreme self-sabotage? The media, the public, and even Stamos himself had spent years blaming his collapse on the obvious external triggers. They blamed the suffocating pressure of being Uncle Jesse. They blamed the predatory paparazzi culture. They blamed the public humiliation of a failed marriage to a supermodel. These were all valid, immense pressures that would crush any normal human being. They were the undeniable catalyst that accelerated his descent. But in the quiet, clinical rooms of the rehabilitation center, stripped of his wealth, his fame, and his defensive charm, Stamos realized that these external forces were merely the weather. They were not the root of the earthquake. The alcohol had not been a weapon used to fight off the tabloids. It had been a heavy iron door desperately held shut to keep a much darker, much older monster trapped in the basement of his subconscious. To achieve actual sobriety, to not simply stop drinking, but to overcome his overwhelming despair, He had to open that door. He had to look past the broken marriage, past the television cameras, and past the blinding lights of the Hollywood machine. He had to travel backward through time, past his 20s, past his teenage years, all the way back to a quiet suburban neighborhood in the 1970s. The true architecture of his self-destruction was not built on a Hollywood soundstage. It was built in a childhood bedroom. The public thought they had witnessed the ultimate exposure of his secrets with the DUI arrest. They believed they knew the absolute worst of his sins, but they were looking at the wrong decade, and they were looking at the wrong crime. The real story, the devastating truth that would fundamentally alter the legacy of one of television's most beloved figures, had been buried in silence for over 40 years, waiting for the alcohol to clear so it could finally speak. The process of clinical rehabilitation strips a human being down to their absolute baseline. When the chemical numbing agents are systematically removed from the bloodstream, the brain desperately begins searching for the source of the pain it has been tasked with suppressing for decades. For John Stamos, the early days of sobriety were not filled with immediate clarity or triumphant cinematic revelations. They were characterized by a profound, disorienting terror. The intensive therapy sessions pushed him far past the immediate wreckage of his adult life. The medical professionals guiding his recovery forced him to bypass the Hollywood scandals, the bitter divorce, and the career anxieties. They understood a fundamental, unyielding truth about severe, life-threatening addiction. The substance is never the core problem. It is the misguided, desperate solution to an unbearable underlying trauma. To dismantle the addiction and save the man, they had to locate the original wound. This search required Stamos to navigate backward into a mental territory he had unconsciously cordoned off and heavily guarded for over 40 years. He was forced to examine his childhood in Orange County, California, during the 1970s. On the surface, his upbringing appeared idyllic, rooted in a loving, hard-working, and fiercely protective family environment. But human memory is a highly selective editor, and the human brain possesses an astonishing primal defense mechanism designed entirely for childhood survival. When a child is subjected to an event so psychologically overwhelming, so entirely outside their framework of understanding that it threatens to completely shatter their developing psyche, the brain violently intervenes. It compartmentalizes the horror. It takes the traumatic event, places it in a mental box, seals it shut with heavy psychological locks, and buries it in the deepest, most inaccessible recesses of the subconscious. The child is then allowed to continue functioning, to go to school, to laugh, and to grow up, entirely disconnected from the conscious memory of the violation. For decades, John Stamos carried this sealed box without ever acknowledging its existence. He carried it onto the frenetic sets of daytime soap operas. He carried it into the multi-million-dollar corporate boardrooms at ABC, and he carried it down the aisle of his highly publicized, intensely scrutinized wedding. The box was entirely invisible to the world, but its immense gravitational pull dictated every major decision of his life. The desperate, insatiable need to be universally adored, the frantic pursuit of an impenetrable public image, the relentless drive to portray the ultimate, flawless family figure on television. These were not simply the ambitions of a working Hollywood actor. They were the frantic, subconscious defense mechanisms of a wounded child, desperately trying to build an armor so thick, so universally approved, that no one could ever harm him again. The logic of the traumatized mind is simple. If everyone loves you, you are safe. If you are Uncle Jesse, you are untouchable. The lock on that mental box remained intact until he committed to the grueling process of writing his memoir, If You Would Have Told Me, released in 2023. The act of writing a legitimate, unflinching autobiography requires a chronological excavation of one's own history. You cannot construct a truthful narrative without examining the foundation. As Stamos began sorting through the archives of his life, reviewing old photographs, reading past interviews, and attempting to reconstruct the exact timeline of his early years, a terrifying anomaly emerged. There was a dark, silent gap in the narrative, a period around his late elementary school years that felt strangely distorted and physically sickening to approach. As he pushed into that silence, the defensive walls his brain had constructed decades earlier finally began to give way, and the suppressed memory breached the surface. The revelation that emerged was devastating in its stark, brutal reality. When he was approximately 10 or 11 years old, he was left in the care of a female babysitter. In the assumed safety of his own home, in an environment where a child is supposed to be entirely protected by the adults around them, he was subjected to a profound childhood trauma. The details of the trauma, as he would later recount with agonizing difficulty, highlight the unique, paralyzing confusion of childhood vulnerability. He was not attacked by a stranger in a dark alley. He was subjected to a severe boundary violation by an older female figure, explicitly entrusted with his care. The cultural conditioning of the 1970s provided absolutely no framework, no vocabulary, and no safe harbor for a young boy to process this specific type of violation. The prevailing societal narrative of that era dictated that boys were to be tough, that they were not victims, and certainly not victims of older females. Stamos described his immediate reaction to the abuse using a deeply psychological and harrowing term. He played dead. When a child realizes they cannot physically escape a predator, and when they cannot even begin to comprehend the massive betrayal of trust occurring, the mind simply detaches from the physical body. It is the ultimate final survival tactic of the powerless. You freeze, you endure the physical reality of the deeply troubling event, and you mentally exit the room. You convince yourself that if you do not react, if you show absolutely no emotion, the horror will eventually stop and you can pretend it never actually happened. This was the exact moment the trauma was packaged and buried. The young John Stamos got up, locked the memory away in the vault, and walked into the rest of his life pretending he was entirely whole. This specific type of suppressed, unresolved trauma acts like a slow-acting psychological poison within the human system. The victim operates under the illusion of normalcy, often achieving great external success. But the internal architecture is fundamentally compromised. The profound shame associated with the event, the irrational yet entirely common belief among survivors that they were somehow responsible, that they should have fought back, that they were complicit in their own abuse, metastasizes in the dark. It breeds a deep-seated subconscious self-loathing. The adult Stamos, despite being universally celibate, aided as one of the most attractive, charismatic, and successful men in the entertainment industry, was secretly operating on the core, unshakable belief that he was fundamentally damaged, dirty, and unworthy of genuine love. This hidden shame illuminates the darkest corners of his adult life and fundamentally changes how we must view his career. It explains the intense, agonizing dissonance he experienced at the absolute height of his television fame. The millions of screaming fans, the massive syndication deals, the magazine covers, They were all cheering for a flawless phantom, a leather-clad fiction that did not actually exist. The louder the applause grew for Uncle Jesse, the more intensely the broken child inside felt like a complete fraud. How could he accept the adulation of the entire world when he held a secret he believed was entirely shameful? This is the terrible, inescapable paradox of the traumatized celebrity. The immense fame does not heal the childhood wound. It magnifies the isolation to an unbearable degree. You are surrounded by millions of people who claim to love you, but you know with absolute terrifying certainty that they are only loving the mask. Furthermore, the specific nature of his most famous role created a psychological torture chamber. On Full House, John Stamos was paid millions of dollars to play the ultimate protector of children. Uncle Jesse was the man who kept the kids safe, who offered wisdom, and who ensured no harm ever came to the vulnerable members of his family. The irony is suffocating. The man playing the ultimate protector was, in reality, a completely unprotected child who had never received justice or comfort for his own violation. Every time he read a script about family safety, every time he delivered a heartfelt monologue about protecting the innocent, it was a brutal, unconscious reminder of his own deeply painful history. The eventual self-destruction, the spectacular collapse of his high-profile marriage, and the near-fatal descent into severe alcoholism can finally be understood not as the arrogant, entitled missteps of a spoiled Hollywood actor, but as the inevitable catastrophic failure of a psychological containment system. The alcohol was never a party drug. It was an anesthetic. It was the only substance powerful enough to quiet the subconscious alarms that were constantly ringing in his head. When the external pressures of the paparazzi, the divorce, and the fading career became too intense, the heavy lid on the mental box began to rattle. The trauma was threatening to surface, and Stamos instinctively, desperately reached for the bottle to drown it before it could reach his conscious mind. He was willing to destroy his career, his reputation, and his physical health if it meant keeping that memory buried. Confronting this reality in his late 50s required a level of immense raw courage that far surpasses any performance he ever delivered on a soundstage. Speaking the words aloud to his therapist was the first agonizing step. He had to dismantle the ultimate cultural taboo. For a man whose entire public identity was built on an aggressive, confident, and highly packaged brand of traditional television masculinity, admitting to being a survivor of severe early trauma felt like stepping into an execution chamber. The Hollywood machine does not reward vulnerability, it aggressively exploits it. He knew that by bringing this secret into the light, he was handing the tabloid industry the ultimate weapon. He knew the headlines would be heavily sensationalized, that the details of his trauma would be debated on daytime talk shows by people who did not know him, and that a massive segment of the public would inevitably view him through a new, uncomfortable lens of pity. Yet he made the deliberate choice to publish the truth. This decision was the ultimate turning point in his narrative. It was the moment he finally stopped running from the ghosts of his past. By writing T, he words down, by making them an unalterable matter of public record, he stripped the trauma of its lethal power. Secrecy is the oxygen that allows shame to survive and multiply. By forcing the secret into the open air, he effectively suffocated the shame. He realized that the only way to genuinely heal, the only way to ensure his sobriety was permanent and not just a temporary pause, was to completely destroy the artificial, flawless idol he had spent his entire life protecting. Uncle Jesse had to die so that John Stamos could finally live. The publication of his memoir was the final severing of the invisible contract he had signed back in the 1980s. When John Stamos placed his darkest, most closely guarded trauma into the public domain, he fundamentally altered the power dynamic between himself and the Hollywood machine. For the first time in his professional existence, the tabloids had nothing left to steal from him. The paparazzi could no longer threaten him with exposure because he had already exposed himself. This act of radical transparency did not instantly erase the psychological scars, nor did it magically cure the neurological pathways altered by years of severe alcohol dependency. Sobriety is a daily, grueling maintenance protocol, not a finish line. But the truth provided a solid, uncompromising foundation upon which a genuine human life could finally be constructed. The frantic, exhausting performance of perfection was over. He was allowed to be flawed, aging, and undeniably human. This structural shift in his psyche paved the way for the stability he had desperately sought during his chaotic 30s and 40s. In 2018, at the age of 54, he married actress and model Caitlin McHugh. The union was markedly different from the highly orchestrated, heavily surveilled spectacle of his first marriage. It was grounded in the reality of his recovery, built by a man who had already survived the absolute worst of his own self-destruction. The subsequent birth of their son, Billy, represented a profound closing of a psychological circle. Stamos, the man who had spent a decade playing a fictional father figure on television, while silently harboring the wounds of his own deeply painful history, was now tasked with the actual, unglamorous, and deeply terrifying responsibility of protecting a child in the real world. He frequently points to this era of his life as his only period of true, unmanufactured happiness. He is no longer acting the role of the protector. He is actively breaking the cycle of generational trauma, ensuring his son will never have to navigate the silent horrors that defined his own youth. John Stamos survived the physical containment of the late 20th century studio system, an era built on multi-year syndication contracts and soundstage isolation. By publishing the unvarnished truth of his trauma, he actively destroyed the most valuable asset the network had built, the illusion of the flawless idol. He reclaimed his autonomy. But the entertainment machine itself faced no reckoning. The executives who profited from his youth retired with intact portfolios. The system simply recalibrated, replacing network executives with algorithmic surveillance, seamlessly continuing its core function, extracting profit from human vulnerability. Rebellion is a luxury few Hollywood assets survive. The industry demands compliant idols. When a star's mental fractures threaten to expose the rot beneath the studio floorboards, they become a massive financial liability. The dark economic reality of this era dictated that a dead star was often the perfect corporate asset. Mortality guarantees syndication without the ongoing risk of public scandal. While Stamos navigated the labyrinth and found the exit, others operating under the exact same crushing pressures reached a point where their existence became more problematic than their box office returns. And then they were gone. Police reports were filed swiftly. PR teams sued somber statements. The public accepted a clean, plausible narrative. But the architecture of a Hollywood cover-up always leaves physical evidence. In our next investigation, we strip away the PR mythology surrounding another beloved figure from this era. We will examine the shattered timeline, the exact financial maneuvers executed within 24 hours of the body's discovery, and the identity of the industry fixer who who arrived long before the paramedics. It was not a tragic mental health failure. It was a death meticulously disguised as the perfect Hollywood accident.